As you may have already read in your bulletin, this summer we are going to be journeying through the book of Acts in our worship life together, exploring the journey of that first church and those first believers and what God was up to in their midst. The book of Acts is actually a sequel to the Gospel of Luke, written by the same author, Luke. And as we heard recounted last week, Acts is off and running by the second chapter with the story of Pentecost. For those of you who weren't here last week, we celebrated Pentecost together, the arrival of God's Spirit among God's people. A Spirit that gave life and breath to the church and set the church on a path to begin to share the gospel to the ends of the earth. Immediately following this Pentecost story, but just prior to our text today, in the second chapter of Acts, we find the early church in its first few days and weeks of life. Enjoying a blissful existence, it is an exciting time for the first church. God's people are basking in the afterglow of the fire and the wind of Pentecost. And remember, the division and difference that used to stand between neighbors has been swept away as God's Spirit blew like a mighty wind into the church. And to top it all off, Peter is on his game in his preaching. So much so that thousands, Acts tells us 3,000 people were dying to get a taste of this living water immediately after they heard Peter preach. Lining up down the street and around the corner to be baptized, this early church, this first church, was bursting at the seams and growing by leaps and bounds, and it was beautiful. But not just beautiful because of the number of people being baptized, beautiful because of the things that they were doing together. In our text today, Luke attempts to describe the early church, and he paints a picture of idyllic perfection. All who believed were together. They had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Day by day, as they spent much time in the temple, they broke bread at home. They ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the goodwill of all the people. And day by day, the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. This early church was glowing. It was booming. It was the quintessential idyllic society marked by shared meals and prayers, awe and reverence, communal sharing, ritual faithfulness, love, generosity, joy, goodwill, and growth. The early church was raising its sails and learning to catch the wind of God's Spirit, and the Spirit was creating this beautiful world where God's people loved one another and cared for one another in whatever way they each had need. And together, they loved and served the Lord. Now, we're all familiar with the honeymoon phase. Those first few weeks or months of a new relationship or marriage when we throw ourselves into the newness and excitement, living in a breathtaking bubble of happiness that feels like it just might last forever. That period of time when we do things we might not normally do, or we go places we wouldn't normally go, because we are deep in the throes of new love and we're going out of our way to woo and impress and spend time together. Everyone is helping with the dishes. We finish each other's sentences. We only fight about who loves each other more, and flowers are showing up at the doorstep on a weekly basis. You know what I'm talking about. It is joyful and blissful and sweet, and no matter how many times we've been through this song and dance before, when we're in the middle of that blissful beginning, we halfway convince ourselves it just might be this fantastic and this easy forever. And given the blissful beginnings for the church that we read about in Acts, one could easily claim that they too were enjoying their honeymoon. A blissful season of life when everyone loved each other well and everyone pitched in with the dishes. It must have been the honeymoon. After all, we need only read a few more chapters in Acts to learn that this rosy beginning starts to fade. Shadows and fractures develop, the idyllic community cannot be sustained. The honeymoon is over. And the church will have to begin the harder work of learning to be faithful when it's not quite so easy anymore. But that's a story for another Sunday. Today, I want us to bask in the honeymoon. We have a small amount of insight into this honeymoon phase, this seemingly unrealistic, unsustainable early chapter in the church's life, when life together is marked by generosity and care and signs and wonders and shared meals and shared joy. It is a beautiful sight to behold and worthy of our attention to see what God might be up to. And speaking of honeymoons and all that goes with them, unless you've been living under a rock the past week, you too are aware that the world recently celebrated the love, perhaps even the honeymoon phase of a beautiful young couple in the form of a royal wedding. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle exchanged their vows before a worldwide audience estimated to be about 2 billion people. And the wedding did not disappoint. But I'll be honest, in the midst of the royal fanfare, I was not prepared to go to church. I was not prepared to hear the gospel proclaimed so boldly and so beautifully. And so I was not prepared for Bishop Michael Curry. Bishop Curry caused me to imagine what it must have been like to hear Peter preach all those years ago, a bold witness to the gospel, the likes of which could bring thousands to the waters of baptism. I'm going to tell you a little bit about his sermon here today, but if you have not seen it, go home and watch it. You too might be taken to church. In his sermon prepared for this royal event and this global audience, Bishop Curry spoke about the power of love. And he started with a quote from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. "We must discover the power of love, the redemptive power of love, and when we do that, we will make of this old world a new world. For love is the only way, and there is power in that love." Bishop Curry went on to remind his listeners that the power of love in this world has to do with its source being the eternal and triune God, and that where love is found, God is always there. He reminded those gathered of Jesus' commandment to love God and love neighbor, and also of Jesus' proclamation that on these two hang all the law and all the prophets. Love God, love your neighbor. And lest we simplify love or over-sentimentalize love, he reminded us of the love that we know in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. It is not a love that was selfish or self-centered, but rather a love that was sacrificial and thus became redemptive. That way of unselfish, Sacrificial, redemptive love changes lives, and it can change the world, preached Bishop Curry. If you don't believe me, he said, think and imagine a world where love is the way. Imagine our homes and families when love is the way. Imagine neighborhoods and communities when love is the way. Imagine governments and nations when love is the way. Imagine business and commerce when love is the way. Imagine this tired old world when love is the way. When love is the way, unselfish, sacrificial, redemptive, then no child will go to bed hungry in this world ever again. When love is the way, he said, we will let justice roll down like water and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Poverty will be history, earth will become a sanctuary. We will lay down our swords and shields down by the riverside and study war no more. When love is the way, there is plenty good room for all of God's children. Because when love is the way, we treat each other like we are actually family. When love is the way, we know that God is the source of us all, and we are brothers and sisters, children of God. And it is a new heaven and a new earth, a new human family, when love is the way. And you know what I kept thinking about as Bishop Curry was preaching? I kept thinking about the second chapter of Acts. And no, I didn't make that up so it would sound good this morning. I couldn't help but think about this passage from Acts that we have read. Because as Bishop Curry was preaching, he talked about harnessing the power of love, love that was redemptive and sacrificial and beautiful and caused all of us to treat one another like brothers and sisters. And I couldn't help but think about this first church that had just taken its first breath of the Spirit of God and was filled and empowered to love one another and care for one another and have the good will of everyone in mind. In all that they did, loving each other as brothers and sisters, loving God and neighbor in everything they did together. Listen to it again. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and their goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Day by day, they spent much time together in the temple. They broke bread in homes together. They ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the goodwill of all the people. That is love, friends. Unselfish love, sacrificial love, redemptive love. Imagine the church when love is the way. I think it might look a lot like this church in Acts 2. As I look at this early church and as I look at the things that they did together and for each other, they were living this life of love, love that was unselfish, sacrificial, redemptive. For all were treated with dignity and respect, all were treated with humanity and decency, and all were filled with the love of God. You say that you love me, Jesus calls, well, feed my sheep. And that is what the church did. In its earliest hours, the church embraced Christ's call to love God and neighbor so fully that all were reminded of their worth in God's eyes. That is love, friends. Love defined that first church. Love filled the hearts of those who sought after God and cared for their neighbors. Love defined their life with one another, and it began to transform the world. It could have been a honeymoon, and it would be in some respects, as we will explore more throughout this summer. But that doesn't mean it wasn't worth seeking after. You know, people often ask me about ideas for growing the church. And typically those conversations move into new programs or new ideas or new opportunities or new things that we could build together. And all of that is great. But I'll tell you what I have known to be true more than anything else. What matters more than any program we could come up with, or any gimmick we could offer to get people through our door, what matters is whether or not people feel loved here. It matters whether they see love here. Not love that's over-sentimentalized, but unselfish. Sacrificial, redemptive love. Because when people see God here, when people see love here, they're also going to see God. That early church was a beautiful sight to behold. And wouldn't it be lovely if that's what the church looked like all the time? A church where love was the way. May it be so. Amen.